Okay, good morning, everyone. In the continuation of series of lectures, third series of lecture, this is now third lecture. As we have decided that we will keep the lectures from our own palliative medicine post MDs. So this lecture will be taken by Puneet. Puneet is again, as Arun and Anuja is famous for first MDs from Tata Memorial Hospital. Nandan and Puneet are first MDs from AIIMS Hospital, AIIMS New Delhi. Right now, Puneet, after finishing his MD, is doing senior residency, same in AIIMS. He's a good, he likes to take lectures, and he's participating in various teaching program of the department, and he is also taking lectures and participating in various national and international conferences. He has got, I think, 13 publications. This is just first year MD senior residency. After, I think, 13 publication is good number. And he is also recipient of Bruce Davis Gold Medal, which everybody dream for, all young palliative care physician. And he was awarded for best paper presentation in APCON 2020. So without wasting time, we should start. And Puneet is going to take the very important aspect of our management plan, that is how to take care of the patients when they are having increased intracranial pressure. Patient is having continuously falling through, having fits, convulsions, and as always, everyone will keep their lecture question answer at the please in the chat box, and Arun will sort out at which questions is on priority, and we will try to finish it within time. So Puneet, I just request you, please don't do very fast, but please be aware of the timings. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Puneet. Go ahead.
So, good morning, everyone. Ma'am, am I audible?
You are audible, and this should be slideshow.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So, good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to. I'm very grateful to ma'am who has provided me the opportunity to present this lecture, and I'll be trying my very best to help all my co-colleagues and juniors who are doing MD to get a fair bit of idea in these three topics. So today my topic is approach to a patient with following neurological emergencies in raised intracranial pressure, status epilepticus, and posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome. So before starting with the before starting with my lecture, I would like to deal with the basics related to the brain, related to my topic. So here, as you can see in the picture, this is the brain, which has the cerebral cortex, the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the blood, which supplies the brain. And the blue structure, as you can see, is the CSF. So in the cerebral cortex, we know that there are four lobes, namely that is the frontal lobe, which deals with reasoning, planning, speech, movement, problem solving. Then back behind this, you have the parietal lobe, which deals with the movement, orientation, perception, recognition. Here, there is the central sulcus, and just above, in front of it, in the frontal lobe, there is the motor cortex, which helps us in all the motor activities which we do. And just behind there, we have the somatosensory cortex. Similarly, this is the occipital lobe, which helps in the visual processing. Similarly, a temporal lobe here, which helps in the auditory functions.
Puneet, can you do the slideshow, please? This is
yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. In the previous figure, as you can see, this is a rigid structure, that is the vault. It comprises of three structures: brain, CSF, and blood. The volumes are fixed. fixed. The blood volume which supplies the arteries carries the oxygen, the nutrients, and then they drain out through the venous complexes. So in the Monro doctrine, you can see that since the cranium is a rigid and fixed volume, the sum of the volume of the brain, CSF, and intracranial blood is constant. So what is the volume of brain in the skull? That is around 1400 to 1500 ml, and the CSF constitutes around 150 ml. The blood constitutes around 150 ml. So what does the Monro-Kelly doctrine basically says? It says that if any of the volume increases, one of the volume increases, so basically what happens, the resultant will be that there will be increase in the intracranial pressure. So this is the basics of our lecture. So we will try to keep in mind about this Monro-Kelly doctrine. So before moving on, we should very well understand what is the pressure required to perfuse the brain. So this is given by the formula, that is the CPP is equal to the MAP minus the ICP. What is CPP? CPP is the cerebral perfusion pressure. What is the MAP? This is the mean arterial pressure. And what is the ICP? This is the intracranial pressure. So what is CCP? CCP has to be in a certain range which allows blood to provide nutrients as well as oxygen to the brain. In a simple fact that we can say that it helps in the regulation of blood in the brain. So what is the normal value of CPP? The normal value of CPP ranges between 50 to 100 mmHg. The second, that is the mean arterial pressure. What is mean arterial pressure? It is the pressure which helps in the blood coming to the brain. So how do we calculate mean arterial pressure? Mean arterial pressure is calculated as 1/3 of the pulse pressure minus the diastolic pressure. So the normal value or the normal mean arterial pressure which we target, or which we say that it is within the normal range, it is around 65 to 110 mmHg. And the third, that is the intracranial pressure. It is the pressure within the CSF, that is called the intracranial pressure. So just remember the Monro doctrine, what we had said, that any increase in the volume of parenchyma or the blood tissue or CSF or the cerebral blood volume will increase the ICP. So whenever there is the increase in intracranial pressure, the cerebral perfusion pressure will decrease. So what is the importance now? What is the importance of the statement? It means that the blood perfusion decreases and the blood supply to the brain gets hampered, and so various symptoms will come up. So this is CPP is equal to MAP minus ICP. So what is ICP basically? ICP is the intracranial pressure. It is the pressure inside the skull, or more specifically, the pressure of CSF that fills the four brain ventricles and the subarachnoid space around the brain. As you can see in this figure, this is the CSF in the ventricles basically, and the pressure of the CSF, it's normally referred to as the pressure as the intracranial pressure. So what is the normal ranges of the intracranial pressure? In adults, it is generally 10 to 15 mmHg. In children, it is lower, that is, it is 3 to 7 mmHg. And term infants, it's very low, that is, it ranges from 1 to 5 to 6 mmHg. Right. So now we have known what is the Monro doctrine. Now we know that whenever there is increase in one of these volumes, that is the brain, the CSF, or blood, that will increase the ICP. So whatever causes the increase in blood whatever causes the increase in brain volume, for example, any blood hematoma, blood tumor, blood contusions, will increase the volume of the blood. Brain. So what will happen indirectly? It will increase the ICP. So similarly, whenever there is increase in CSF, for example, choroid plexus papilloma is there, where a lot of secretions of CSF is seen, and where absorption or obstruction is there, where the CSF it's higher in amount and reduced obstruction is there. There you can see that there is increase in ICP. And similarly, whenever there is a increase in cerebral blood volume, so there will be increases in intracranial pressure. So in this table, I have briefly described what are the causes of increase ICP related to the brain parenchyma, blood, and CSF. So whenever there is increase of tumor, whenever there is a tumor, whenever there is cerebral edema secondary to trauma, infection, or infarction, wherever there is cerebral abscess, whenever there is any cerebral contusion, so the blood parenchyma volume will be increased. Indirectly, ICP will increase. Similarly, what causes the blood volume expansion? It is caused by intracerebral subarachnoid extradural hematomas, or it may be seen whenever there is arterial dilatation secondary to hypoxemia, hypercarbia, hyperthermia. And it may also be seen whenever there is venous dilatation secondary to venous obstruction from high PEEP, also coughing, straining, heart failure, and head tilt down. Similarly, whenever there is increase in CSF, the conditions are whenever there may be hydrocephalus, whenever there may be meningeal diseases, whenever there is choroidal plexus tumor. So whenever there is disorders of CSF absorption following whole brain RT, and various spinal cord tumors. So this will result in CSF. So these are the basic causes of raised intracranial tension, which I had tried to enumerate in this small table. So what is cerebrospinal fluid? The brain cavity has an estimated capacity of around 1600 to 1700 ml, and out of which 150 ml is occupied by the CSF. So the daily production of CSF is around 500 ml at a rate of around 0.35 ml per minute. Two-thirds is produced by the choroidal plexus and one-third by the arachnoid membranes and the brain. So here in this figure, you can see the pathway of CSF. Here in these choroidal plexus, it is produced. It goes to the lateral ventricle. From the lateral ventricle, it moves down to the third ventricle through the interventricular foramina. Through the third ventricle, it goes down to the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct. And from the fourth ventricle, it moves down to the subarachnoid space, where it is absorbed by the arachnoid villi of dural sinuses, and following this cycle keeps on repeating, that is formation and the absorption. So whenever there is any obstruction of the tract, it may lead to increase in CSF, or whenever there is increased secretion, for example, increase in papilloma, cerebral papilloma, there is increase of CSF. So these are the conditions which increases the amount of CSF in the ventricle. So what is hydrocephalus basically? It is nothing but it is the amount of the CSF which is increased in the ventricles. So here in the picture, you can clearly see that whenever there is increase in the amount of CSF in the ventricle, it causes raised intracranial pressure, which indirectly presses the parenchyma, right? This we can recall by the Monry doctrine, Monry-Kelly doctrine. So whenever there is increased CSF, more is the pressure, more will be the lesser will be the cerebral perfusion pressure, lesser will be the blood to the brain, and more will be the ischemic effect, where the sign and symptoms will be present. So now, after we have read about the Monro-Kelly doctrine, about the various causes, now it is very important to know what is the auto-regulation and compensation of the brain. So here we can see that can you see the figure here? In the figure, you can see that it is not a linear. It is not a linear relationship. That is, the compliance is not a really linear relationship. Here in the x-axis, you can see that this is the volume axis, and in the y-axis, you can see that this is the ICP. So what happened is that the compliance decreases as the combined volume of any of the intracranial component increases, right? Initially, there will be compensation. How will be the compensation? There will be a displacement whenever there is increase of CSF. So there will be decrease of the CSF, and there will be displacement of the CSF to the thecal tissues. This is one mechanism. And second is that there will be decrease in the venous blood via vasoconstriction, and there will be extracranial drainage of the venous blood. So whenever there is decrease in volume of central venous blood, vasoconstriction and decrease of displacement, the compensatory mechanism takes place. And whenever this compensatory mechanism is disturbed, or whenever this compensatory mechanism is exhausted, the brain says that now it's enough, I cannot handle. So what happens that whenever there is small increase in volume, so you can see that now there will be massive increase in the ICP. So this is the auto regulation of and the compensation of brain. This is very, very important function of the brain, which helps us to deal effectively. So similarly, in the right hand side, the figure, you can see in the exercise axis, that is, there is the mean arterial pressure and the cerebral blood flow on the y-axis. Here you can see the relationship, or the non-linear relationship or compliance between the hypertensive and the normotensive patient and the cerebral blood flow. So here, what does the red figure identify? It says that this is of the normotensive person, and whereas the red, it means that the normal autoregulatory function of the chronic hypertensive patient, it's shifted now to the right hand side. This is very, very important, because whenever we are treating hypertension in these patients, we should always take into mind that we should not decrease the hypertension acutely. Why? Because whenever we decrease the hypertension acutely, what will happen now, since the normal auto-regulation is shifted to the right hand side, and acutely, if you decrease the BP, the cerebral blood flow will decrease and it will lead to ischemia. So this is the importance of knowing the auto-regulation and compensation of the blood. So now we come to the sign and symptoms of raised intracranial pressure. The first and most important symptom is the decrease in the GCS, that is decrease in consciousness. We know that whenever ICP increases, cerebral perfusion decrease, and hence there will be less blood supply, less oxygen, and hence decrease in consciousness. So decrease in consciousness can be very readily evaluated using the Glasgow Coma Scale. It has 15 points where it is divided into 3 components, that is eye-opening responses, verbal responses, and the motor responses. The total responses is 15, that is normal, when the person is absolutely normal. Whenever the total count is 8, that means we say that it is the person may be comatose, and whenever the point is 3, we say that we can conclude that the patient is dead. So Glasgow Coma Scale has to be in mind. It has to be marked up properly by all the MDs, and with this we may be able to know what is the GCS status of the patient, the current GCS status of the patient. So now the second symptom is headache. It is one of the most common symptoms. So what causes the headache? Whenever there is increase in the intracranial pressure by any reasons, that is the volume increases inside. So what happens is that the brain is surrounded by the meninges. So whenever the ICP increases, the brain tissue volume increases, it stretches the meninges. So the stretching of the meninges here is responsible for the cause of pain, that is headache. So this headache is also generally seen as a classic morning headache. Why is it so? Suppose a person is there who has of ICP, who has slept for 6 to 8 hours in the normal lying position. So now what happens is that the normal gravity cannot take into effect, and the venous drainage won't be proper. So what happens is that the venous pooling will be there in the brain, the edema will be more, the stretching of meninges will be more. So whenever he gets up in the morning, he feels that there is a throbbing headache, and particularly why? Because of the throbbing nature and due to the stretching of the meninges. So now what we can deduct from here is that positioning will be very, very helpful. So whenever we are dealing with these patients, we should always tell our patient that proper positioning should be good. A few trials have been done, then they have showed that the best position for these patients is that there should be a normal head tilt of around 25 to 30 degree, so that continuously whenever he's lying for a long period of time, venous pooling takes place, and venous edema does not be there. And second important thing of position is that whenever the patient is lying, we should not ask the patient to be reflexing his neck. Why? Because whenever the patient reflexes his neck, there will be obstruction, venous obstruction, and more venous pooling of blood will be there. So the proper positioning is very, very necessary for the management of these symptoms. The third and very important symptom is vomiting. So why vomiting? So as we know, we had seen in the CSF pathway regarding the fourth ventricle, we know that the vomiting center lies just below the fourth ventricle, that is the area prostrema. So whenever high increase in intracranial tension is there, the area prostrema gets activated and hence vomiting is there. Second thing is that whenever there is high intracranial pressure, the brain stem gets compressed. So we know that the brain stem is the origin of various cranial nerves. Similarly, a nerve is there, that is the 10th vagus nerve. So whenever the vagus nerve is irritated, so what happens, the vagus nerve is a parasympathetic nerve, it goes to the GI complexes and it causes vomiting. So these are the mechanism by which vomiting is seen in the raised intracranial pressure. The catch point of this raised intracranial pressure is that the vomiting will be projectile, and the amount of blood, the amount of vomitus which is coming out will be greater than 100 ml. So this is vomiting. Now, an important thing about vomiting is that this is generally not associated with nausea. The fourth symptom is the diplopia. It is caused by the irritation or the palsy of the abducens nerve. We know that the abducens nerve is a long tortuous course, has a long tortuous course from the pons to the lateral rectus. It has the longest intracranial extension. So whenever there is intracranial pressure, this abducens nerves get compromised and diplopia is seen. Now coming to the very, very important and the late symptom, that is the Cushing reflex or the Cushing tride. So why Cushing tride happens? So let us recall again the Monroe doctrine. It says that the CPP is equal to MAP minus the ICP. Whenever the ICP is increased, the CPP decreases. That is, the amount of blood coming to the brain gets decreased. So now the brain says, right now I'm not getting enough amount of oxygen. So it says, hypothalamus, you need to work. And what does the hypothalamus do? It sends out signals to the body and to the heart, especially by the beta adrenergic 1 and the alpha 1. So what happens is that there is a vasoconstriction of the peripheries. By this vasoconstriction, the blood rushes now to the brain. So what happens now is that there is increase in systolic blood pressure. So this is the first tride, that is the increase in the blood pressure. Now, whenever there is increase in systolic blood pressure, so the body also receives it in the baroreceptor zone, aortic receptors, the chemoreceptors. They sense that there is more of blood coming there, and there is increase of blood pressure. So what after it senses, it says that no, now there is enough of blood pressure, now I should decrease it. So it tells the parasympathetic system that now it is your turn to come up and decrease the heart rate. So whenever there is increase in parasympathetic system, so now the second tride will come, that is the decrease in heart rate. Now coming to the third, that is the irregular respiration. It is generally seen whenever there is increased intracranial pressure for long term. What happens is that the brainstem gets compromised. So we know that in the brainstem lies the pons, the medulla, and these are the centers where the respiratory centers are located. So once there is a decrease in blood supply to these systems, so there will be irregular respiration. And the most common type of respiration which is seen here, it's the kind stroke pattern of respiration. Kind stroke respiratory pattern was given by John and William, the John Keynes and William Strokes. So this is the the Cushing reflex or the Cushing tride, and this has to be seen and examined very properly by the students, because I too have identified raised intracranial pressure by seeing this tride: increased BP, decreased heart rate, and irregular respirations. And there are other focal symptoms which can decide and which may be present due, and these symptoms may be identified by the location of the SOL. For example, whenever there is dementia, personality changes, seizures, motor aphasia, gait disturbance, we can say that there is defect of the frontal lobe. Whenever there is agraphia, sensory aphasia, disturbance in 2-point, hemianopia, we can say that the SOL may be lying in the parietal lobe. Whenever there is seizures, whenever there is behavioral alteration, we can say that the SOL location may be the temporal lobe. And whenever there is visual disturbances, we can say that the lesion lies in the occipital lobe. Similarly, when there is a behavioral change, language disorder, contralateral sensory loss, we may say that the lesion is within the thalamus. Whenever there is ataxia, dysmetria, nystagmus, the cerebellum may be the location. And whenever there is ataxia, pupillary abnormalities, nystagmus, or autonomic dysfunctions, we can say that yes, the location may be the brainstem. So this is very, very important to know what are the signs and symptoms, and depending upon the location, we need to identify the symptoms, and based on the symptoms, we need to identify the location. So most of us work in the oncology setting, and we should know what is the etiology of increased ICP in oncology. So basically, ICP is increased due to metastatic bone tumors, post-radiotherapy, hydrocephalus, brain edema, hemorrhage, leukemia, sinus thrombosis, shunt blockage. So we know that the primary brain tumors are responsible for nearly around 2% of all malignancies. And in India, it ranges from 5 to 10 per 1 lakh population. Similarly, secondary bone tumors, these are responsible for most of the brain metastasis. And the most common brain metastasis is seen in lung cancer, followed by breast, melanoma, kidney, colorectal, and ovarian. So what is the mechanism by which ICP is raised in tumors? It, as we had already discussed, the mass effect, that is by the Monro-Kundry doctrine, that is the most common, followed by vasogenic edema, that is tumors which increases the vascular permeability, which increase the vasogenic edema by various growth factors. Most important is the VGFR. So now coming to the management. After knowing what is the pathophysiology, after knowing the various anatomy, after knowing the various symptoms, so now the most important is the management. How do we approach to the management? It is approached by taking a detailed history, sending a routine blood investigation, and getting radiological investigations. So in examination, the first and foremost is sign which we see is the papillary edema. So what is papillary edema? It is nothing but the swelling of the optic disc. Why is it so? Whenever there is increase in intracranial pressure, the arterial supply is good, but the venous supply gets hampered. So what happens is that the venous engorgement takes place and swelling starts to develop. So in this figure, you can see that there is early papillary edema in the optic disc, and in the right side of figure, we can see that there is fully developed papillary edema. And after papillary edema examination, we need to do various cranial nerve examination. It is very important because depending upon the location of lesion, we can lead to this can lead to various palsies of various cranial nerves. So we need to thoroughly examine and deal with the cranial nerves. Another important examination is the signs of meningeal irritations. Whenever there is meningeal irritation, we perform two important signs, that is the Brudzinski sign and the Kernig sign. In the Brudzinski sign, in the right side, you can see whenever the physician asks his patient to lift his neck or flex his neck, what we can see, the response is that the knees also gets flexed. Why? Because there is meningeal irritation. So here, this whenever this happens, we say that Brudzinski sign is positive. Similarly, Kernig signs is that whenever we ask the patient to lie still straight and we flex the legs, and whenever the physician now tries to extend the leg, he can't. Why? Because there is stiffness of the hamstring muscles. So this is positive Kernig sign. So these examination must be done in all the patients. So what are the important investigations which we should do? The most important is investigation which we must do is CT scan, and MRI. These scans will be telling us the various image studies. They can detect various SOL, CSF obstructions. And very important, and the bedside test is the increase in ICP by the ultrasound. What happens is that we measure the optic nerve sheath diameter. Here, as you can see, this is the globe and this is the optic nerve. So wherever you can see that this is the entry point of the optic nerve to the globe. So here we measure the optic nerve sheath diameter. Whenever we measure, we need to take two readings, that is the horizontal and the transverse. So in normal, the cut point is 3 millimeter, and whenever there is increase, that is more than 5 mm, we say that yes, now we can say that it is due to raised intracranial pressure. Other investigation are CSF analysis, ICP monitoring, transcranial Doppler sonography. So now, very important is the management of raised intracranial pressure. Raised intracranial pressure, for our simplicity, the algorithm has been divided into tier 0, 1, 2, and 3. Tier 0 deals with the standard measures. Tier 1 with the hyperosmolar therapy and CSF diversions. Tier 2 with the sedation and analgesics. And tier 3 when all these tiers are not working or it's not helpful, then tier 3 it's used where we allow the patient to go into coma or paralysis by using the barbiturates. So coming to our tier 0, this is symptomatic treatment, that is assessment for adequate circulation, airway patency, and ventilation has to be there. Proper positioning, as I mentioned, has to be there. That is head elevation of around 20 to 30 degrees with head in midline. Whenever there is increase in intracranial pressure, that is whenever which mechanism which triggers intracranial pressure, like the Valsalva maneuver or raise intra-abdominal pressure, these should be managed. And also hyperthermia should be treated with antipyretics, and whenever there is derangement of hyponatremia, it should be corrected. Blood pressure control should be done effectively. Remember that eliminating acute peak should not be there. Why? Because as I told you, in the autoregulatory effect, whenever we treat aggressively the blood pressure, it may impair the CPP, eventually may cause vasogenic edema. And the last is a role of IV dexamethasone, that is a role of corticosteroids in space occupying lesions. There are various studies done for this, and all the studies shows that dexamethasone is very helpful in decreasing the vasogenic edema due to the space occupying lesion. How it decreases the VGEF response. So indirectly what happens is that the blood brain barrier gets optimized, the blood vessels get optimized, and the capillary leak is not there, and hence the vasogenic edema gets subside. So it is said, it is now the question arises, what is the optimal dose? Generally, there is no optimal dose of dexamethasone. It is individualized. Generally, we can start with 0.25 to 0.5 mg per kg daily, and then it can be titrated. One of the study by Sebin et al. Showed the medical decompressive therapy for primary and metastatic intracranial tumors. Here, what happened was that whenever there was less symptoms, that is mild headache or no vomiting, they started with 6 mg of dexamethasone. And when this was not treated properly, or if there was now increase of focal deficit or new worsening focal deficit with more of headache and more of vomiting, it was increased to 12 milligram. And whenever there was now again not resolving, or there is again altered consciousness, you may increase up to 24 mmHg. But whenever you're increasing the dexamethasone, you should always keep in mind the toxicities. And whenever you're using dexamethasone, you should always remember that appropriate appropriate tapering of doses must be there. Why? Because if no proper tapering is there, we may see corticosteroid withdrawal syndrome. What is corticosteroid withdrawal syndrome? It is nothing but there may be myopathies, there may be arthritis like features, there may be various myalgias. We don't want this after giving after giving dexamethasone. So whenever you're giving dexamethasone, proper dose should be individualized and proper tapering has to be done. Now coming to tier 1, so now is the role of various hyperosmolar therapy. So the beneficial effect of hyperosmolar therapy requires effective blood-brain barrier. The most important drug which we use is the 20% mannitol solution at initial doses of around 0.25 gram per kg to around 1 gram per kg body weight. And it can be followed every 3 to 6 hourly. Similarly, hypertonic saline is available in concentration from 2 to 23% and can be administered as a bolus alone or in addition to mannitol. Monitoring of serum osmolality is very much required, and also monitoring serum level of sodium, urea, and creatinine. Whenever there is increase of CSF, now we can plan for some CSF drainage by some ventricular system, ventricular shunt, or we may we may use some ventricular shunt which decreases the CSF. Also, mechanical ventilation can be tried in tier 1. So now we know that whenever ICP is controlled after tier 1, yes or no. If it is yes control, so we do a CT scan to rule out new processes, or we try to find out what was the reason. And now if it is not controlled, so we go for further surgical options. So the surgical options may be decompression. So there may be use of stereotactic radiosurgery and radiotherapy. So before going into surgery, we should always know which patients can benefit from surgery and which may not. This is mainly given by recursive partitioning analysis, RPA. This is divided into 3 classes, that is class 1, 2, 3. Third class is when the KPS score is less than 70, and class 1 when the age is less than 65, KPS is good, it is greater than 70, and whenever there is controlled primary tumor and no extracranial metastasis is there. So whenever class 1 is there, we can say that the mean survival time is good, relatively good, and we can go for surgery. And whenever there is class 3, we can say that there is no point of going into extensive surgery, and the best will be to give a supportive management. So in decompression, resection of brain metastasis leads to improve overall survival compared to whole brain artery. Patients with multiple metastasis may be candidates for surgery provided each lesion is considered resectable. And whenever lesion is found within the basal ganglia, thalamic, and brainstem, so these are not considered for resection. And other important modalities are the stereotactic radiosurgery and the radiotherapy. Whenever these tumors are radiosensitive, we can go with these modalities. So coming to the tier 2, whenever it is not dealt by tier 0 and 1, tier 2 can be tried. In tier 2, propofol is the drug which has shown to reduce the cerebral metabolic demand of the blood and the blood volume flow. And hence, there will be decrease in intracranial pressure. And in tier 3, this is the most aggressive and it constitutes the highest adverse reaction. It includes basically the administration of phenobarbital. So the phenobarbital is given as a bolus of 10 milligram per kg over 30 to 40 minutes, and then it is given at a maintenance infusion dose. The phenobarbital infusion is continued for around 24 to 96 hours while underlying process driving ICP are treated. Similarly, moderate hypothermia can be given and hyperventilation can be tried. So basically, this was the management of the raised intracranial pressure. So we will be now going to the second topic, that is the status epilepticus. So before dealing with status epilepticus, we should know what are the 3 terms, that is seizure, epilepsy, and convulsion, because we generally confuse with these terms. So seizure is a paroxysmal event due to abnormal excessive hypersynchronous discharge from an aggregate of CNS. And epilepsy is defined as a disorder of the brain characterized by an enduring predisposition to epileptic seizures. So in simple words, we can say that seizure is nothing but a hypersynchronous discharge from an aggregate of CNS, while epilepsy is what? Whenever there are 2 or more seizures, plus there may be any familial disorders, plus there may be any structural brain injury. So we can classify into complex. So this is known as epilepsy. And what is convulsion? Convulsion is nothing but just the motor component of seizure. So how are the seizures or epilepsy classified? These are classified as partial or generalized. This may be simple, complex, or generalized may be primary or secondary. So what happens is generalized seizure is that the depolarization starts within the thalamus, and whenever with the help of calcium ions. So whenever the subcortical depolarization starts, what happens? It sends the thalamocortical signals to the entire cortex. So what happens now is that the entire cortical neurons get depolarized, and via the spinal cord, now it causes generalized symptoms. And in focal seizure, you can see just a foci is situated. Whenever the foci is there, the related neurons get depolarized. It relays to the spinal cord, and then it goes to the particular muscle group. So we may say, for example, whenever generalized seizure is that, whenever we go to our wards, we see that a person is throwing GTCS, all the arms are getting tonic and clonic. So we can say that that is generalized. And suppose what is focal, whenever a patient is there, just a simple movement of the arm is there. So what we can say that just the partial group of muscle is involved, so which can be local, which we can derive is that there may be just a focal lesion which is causing this depolarization. So what is the etiology of seizures in oncology setting? It can be brain parenchymal metastasis, cytotoxic chemotherapy, metabolic encephalopathies, neurologic paraneoplastic syndromes, and cranial irradiation. So this is a very, very important table. When to suspect what? Suppose the seizure is before the diagnosis of tumor. So we can easily say that, yes, maybe it may be a primary CNS tumor, or it may be a tumor with high rate of CNS metastasis, or it may be a paraneoplastic encephalitis or endocrine tumors. Right. So similarly, whenever there is seizure during the administration of cancer therapy, we may say that yes, it may be due to some drug induced or metabolic dearrangements. And whenever the seizure is occurring after a few weeks to months, we may say that now, yes, intracranial metastasis may be the cause, or various CNS infection. And whenever the seizures is occurring many, many months to many, many years after chemotherapy, we can say that it may be due to various CNS infection, post radiation necrosis, intracranial metastasis, paraneoplastic syndromes, and a few others. So this table was very, very important to know what is the cause of seizures in oncology with respect to the timings. So how do we treat epilepsy? Epilepsy, seizure in and of themselves are an important source of morbidity and mortality in patients with primary and secondary brain tumors and require aggressive treatment. So treatment should be combined of anti-epileptic disease and specific treatment. The specific treatments may be surgery, radiation, systemic therapies, for example, chemotherapy. Since if they are chemotherapy sensitive, we may go for intrathecal methotrexate, or likewise, or whenever there is any seizure inducing agent, we may target for its removal. So now, what is status epilepticus? The International League Against Epilepsy has defined status epilepticus as a condition resulting from either the failure of the mechanism responsible for seizure termination, or from the initiation of mechanism that lead to abnormal prolonged seizure, that is after 5 minutes. So for our general, that is our operational definition of seizure epileptic is being followed now. What is it? It is whenever there is greater or equal to 5 minutes of continuous seizures, we may term it as status epilepticus, or whenever there is equal or two discrete seizures between which there is incomplete recovery of consciousness, we may again say that it is status epilepticus. So what are the causes? The causes may be acute structural brain injury by stroke, head trauma, the tumors, the infections, or they may the etiology may be by a long-standing structural brain injury, for example, prior head injury, prior neurosurgery, whenever there is non-adherence or discontinuation in patient with prior epilepsy. This is one of the most common cause of status epilepticus. Whenever there is a withdrawal syndrome, which may be associated with discontinuation of alcohol, barbiturates, or benzodiazepines, whenever there is metabolic abnormalities, that is hypoglycemia, hepatic encephalopathy, hyponatremia, hypoglycemia, hypocalcemia, these metabolic causes can also lead to seizures. And lastly, we can say that the drugs which lower the seizure threshold, for example, cyclosporin, tetracycline, and in palliative setting, for example, tramadol, we know that this is avoided in children. Why? Because it decreases the seizure threshold. So these should be avoided. So what is the management? The management here lies rapid assessment is necessary. Airway, breathing, and circulation should be secured. 2 IV catheters should be placed. Blood sugars should be done, and electrolytes should be managed. So how we will be following an algorithm for the treatment of the status epilepticus. Initially, what we do is we do neurological examination, general evaluation, proper ABC, that is the airway, breathing, and circulation. We send electrolytes, glucose has to be monitored, right? So what is the initial drug therapy? The initial drug therapy is IV lorazepam, and lorazepam is given as 0.1 milligram per kg IV. Maximum is 2 milligram per minute. The alternative to this benzodiazepine is diazepam. That is, it can be given as 0.15 milligram per kg IV up to 10 milligram per dose. We wait to around 5 minutes, and then we see if the seizure does not subside, we repeat the lorazepam dose. So if IV access is not found, an emergency situation is there, we can always go ahead with midazolam IM injection, which is given as 10 milligram IM if weight is greater than 40 kg. In second IV, what do we load? We load first phenytoin, valproic acid, Levira, and phenytoin. First phenytoin is given as 20 milligram per kg phenytoin equivalent doses at 100 to 150 milligram per minute, right? And other drugs which are given as valproic acid, it is given as dose of 30 milligram per kg. Levira is given as 60 milligram per kg. Whenever we give phenytoin or first phenytoin, it is very, very necessary and monitor the cardiac activity. Why? Because phenytoin, it causes arrhythmia, it increases the work of the heart. So the cardiac has to be monitored when giving phenytoin. So the second, coming to the second line is that whenever we had given the first line, that is lorazepam and diazepam, now again we repeat first phenytoin or the other 4 drugs which we had mentioned, if those were not given previously. If the seizure is still there and the oxygen supply to the brain is compromised, we can also plan for mechanical ventilation if the prognosis is good. Continuous BP measuring and cardiac monitoring has to be done. So now after first and second line, if the status epilepticus are not being treated, we may classify now as refractory status epilepticus. So for refractory status epilepticus, we will now be going ahead with various anesthetic agents such as propofol and phenobarbital and midazolam. So midazolam here now it is given as the dose 0.2 milligram per kg IV bolus. We need to continue infusion till we get a seizure free interval, and if the seizures persist after 45 to 60 minutes, change to propofol or barbital. Propofol is generally given as 1 to 2 milligram per kg loading dose over 5 minutes. Continue the infusion, titrate upwards till seizure freedom is there. So if again it is not dealt by propofol, we need to try phenobarbital. That is phenobarbital. The initial dose is 5 milligram per kg over 10 minutes. Repeat as necessary until seizure stops. Then phenobarbital 1 to 5 milligram per kg per hour for 24 hours of seizure freedom. So this algorithm is very, very helpful in tackling or treatment of the status epilepticus, because it gives a stepwise algorithm, and it is very helpful for all of us in our daily practice. So now coming to our third topic for today is the posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome. Posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome is a clinico-radiological syndrome characterized by headache, seizure, altered mental status, visual loss, and it is characterized by white matter vasogenic edema affecting the posterior occipital and the parietal lobes of the brain predominantly. So what is the pathogenesis behind the press? Generally, the pathogenesis is that it is related to disorders of the cerebral autoregulation and endothelial dysfunction. As I previously explained you about the autoregulation, here what happens is that whenever in chronic hypertensive patient, whenever the autoregulation whenever the auto regulation is exhausted, what happens is that more is the increase in BP. So there will be more blood cerebral flow. So whenever there is increase in cerebral flow, it will cause vasogenic leakage, and it will cause more and more of vasogenic edema. So vasogenic edema was a common, and it was a characteristic of press. So here, autoregulatory filial hypertension, as I already explained, there is elevation of blood pressure levels above the upper autoregulatory limit, leading to cerebral hyperperfusion, causes vascular leak and vasogenic edema. The second proposed mechanism is endothelial dysfunction, which are caused by various toxins. For example, endogenous. Sometimes we see that patients of sepsis and preeclampsia, they may show these signs and symptoms and classical vasogenic edema. And also in exogenous, for example, people undergoing chemotherapy, immunosuppressive agent, cytotoxic agent, and few patients who are autoimmune. And these toxins, they trigger the vascular leakage, and edema is formed. So these were the proposed mechanism of press, though none of them are clearly identified. So the risk factors of press are hypertension, immunosuppressive therapies, renal diseases, others, for example, preeclamptic patients, patients of autoimmune disorders, patients of renal diseases, patients of uremia. These are high-risk patients who can manifest this. So what are the clinical manifestations of press? The clinical manifestation of press are nothing but common to the race intracranial pressure, that is headaches, altered consciousness, there may be visual disturbances, there may be seizures, right? So so how do we evaluate and how do we diagnose press? So while there are no specific diagnostic criteria for press, it is becoming an increasing recognized disorder. In the appropriate clinical setting, that is the risk, we keep in mind the risk factors, particularly if the patient has increased hypertension, if he is undergoing any cytotoxic therapy, if he has kidney therapy. And now they had proposed a suggested criteria, that is with the appropriate clinical setting, if he has any neurological symptom of acute onset, or there may be vasogenic edema on neuroimaging, or there may be reversibility of clinical and or radiological findings. So whenever these criteria are fulfilled, we may term that yes, now we can diagnose press. So one important thing to note in mind is that this is the diagnosis of exclusion. Whenever other diagnoses have been excluded, and now when the clinical signs and symptoms and neuroimaging are fitted into this criteria, now we can diagnose press. So here we can see in the CT scan and in the MRI, we can see that in the posterior white matter, we can see that there is a vasogenic edema, and this is characteristic of press. So how do we treat? Treatment is symptomatic and based on the underlying condition. That is, we treat hypertension. A very important thing to note is that while treating hypertension, we should not acutely treat the hypertension, because suppose we try to treat the hypertension aggressively, what will happen, since in these patients the normotensive autoregulation is shifted to the right. So now what will happen, the cerebral perfusion pressure will be decreased, ischemia like features will be there, there will be more of vascular leakage, there will be more of vascular edema. So this will be hampering. So we can also manage the seizures, as I told you, using the various anti-epileptic drugs. And whenever there is increased of immunosuppressive therapies, such as the chemotherapies, immunotherapies such as cyclosporine, tacrolimus, so this has to be discontinued or has to be given in a lower dose, and we should always keep on monitoring the symptoms. Others, such as we should manage the pre-eclampsia like conditions in the pregnancy, and we should treat the autoimmune conditions. So whenever these conditions are treated, what we see is that the neuroimaging edema also gets subsided, the symptoms get subsided, and now these entire symptoms, it gets reversed. Hence the name posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome, that whenever proper treatment at proper timing takes place, all the symptoms gets treated in a good manner, and the residual neurological injuries does not happen. So coming to the summary or the take home message following my lecture: patients with raised intracranial pressures, seizures, brain metastasis, they present with very, very unique challenges. Right. Generally, in our oncological settings, the prognosis is very poor whenever brain mets is identified. We say that yes, it is it is just few months. So the patient has to undergo various physical disabilities and various tumor or treatment effects, and this is in fact fell on him as behavioral effects. There may be some cognition defects, personality defects. He may feel irritated. He may why this repeated seizures are coming, why I'm feeling repeated headaches. So we should treat them effectively. How? So we should discuss the goal of care with the patient and relative. We should say that yes, now the time is limited, so now the goal of care from aggressive should be shifted to some supportive, and whatever are your unmet works, whatever where your unmet works or unmet things, whatever you plan for the patient and what the patient plans, has to be now done very fast, and the goal of care has to be always taken care with the help of multidisciplinary team. There is not always the palliative care physician, the treating oncological team, the treating neurosurgery in case of head trauma, which increases the intracranial pressure, and various occupational therapists who try to help the patient.
Can you finish it, please?
Yes, ma'am.
There are a lot of questions.
Yes, ma'am. So we just need to maintain a sense of hope and provide a holistic care at the end with the aim of a good end of life care. Thank you.
Arun, go ahead with the question.
Thank you, Puneet.
Extensively beautiful lecture, Puneet. Go ahead, Arun.
Puneet, ready? We'll take some questions, Puneet.
Good morning, sir. Yes, sir.
Puneet. Yeah. First question. How long mannitol infusion needs to be continued if it is indicated in intracranial pressure, raised ICP?
Right, sir.
Okay, can you tell us how long mannitol has to be continued?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So the mannitol has to be given for 3 to 5 days only. The reason being that whenever mannitol is started, there should be effective blood-brain barrier, right? So it is an osmotic agent. What happens? It decreases the vasogenic edema from the brain parenchyma and takes down to the body. So whenever there is whenever you're giving whenever you're repeating mannitol for more than 3 to 5 days, so now what happens is that due to the local effects, there is destruction of the blood brain barrier, and now what happens is that the opposite thing happens. Now the mannitol reversal happens, and whenever this mannitol reversal happens, so the instead of extracranial drainage of the fluid, what happens now? There will be increase in the intracranial edema. So it is very, very important to monitor patients while using mannitol, and it should not be continued for more than 3 to 5 days, keeping in mind the mannitol reversible syndrome.
Okay, thank you, Puneet. I think that answers the question. Now, a bit of transdisciplinary question. See how you want to answer the question.
All right, sir.
So as you know that sometimes postnatally there are encephalopathies.
Right, sir.
I think the question encephalopathy is for hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy for the kid.
Right, sir.
So so the question is, wanted to understand the mechanism and treatment of HIE as
All right. So, right.
postpartum, but the question is about the HIE.
Generally what happens is that various infection, and whenever there is increase in the ammonia levels in the body, so what happens is that they causes decreased conscious level. So what happens here is that whenever here also it is almost similar, that whenever hypoxic injury happens, the hypoxic injury happens, the cerebral perfusion decreases, and hence the blood supplying to the brain gets decreases. So a sense of ischemia like features happens. So in hepatic encephalopathy syndrome also, you see that the features of coma, unconsciousness, this is there. Why? Because of the decrease in the blood
Punit,
supply.
not Punit.
Right, sir?
Punit, not hepatic encephalopathy. The question is about HIE, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy.
Right, sir. For
So you are right. It is because of hypoxia.
Right. Yeah. This is the same mechanism. This is what I'm telling. Whenever the cerebral perfusion pressure decreases, there is reduced blood supply to the brain, and hence there is ischemia. So these, whenever there is ischemia to the brain, so now the brain says that I'm not getting enough nutrients and oxygen. I cannot function properly, and hence coma and these other features take place. So this is the mechanism of it, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Punit. There is a primary mechanism, and there is a secondary mechanism which happens after some time, is because of oxidative stress to the brain tissue.
Right,
and the treatment for HIE is again supportive. There are 3 stages of HIE.
Right,
and according to staging, the treatment is supportive and the prognosis differs. Thank you, Punit. There are no further questions. Lots of congratulations, because you have taken a very nice lecture, very nice and lucid slides. The students will be greatly benefited. Thank you very much. Turning over to Dr. Bhatnagar, please.
Okay, thank you, Puneet and Arun. So good to see our youngsters are doing so well. And the future of palliative medicine in India is so bright. I'm so happy to see everything. So I'm overwhelmed, so I won't be able to speak a lot. But thank you, Puneet. It was such a wonderful lecture. You have learned, you have read, you have understood everything, and you have managed so many cases. And I want to say one thing, that the photograph which he has shown about the increased intracranial pressure seen through the papilledema by ultrasound, it is from our own ward. Because in these days, first thing is we used to send to ophthalmology to see the increased intracranial pressure, just come and see the papilledema. But because of COVID, they are restricting themselves. So we have started working with ultrasound, and this is a photograph of our own ward that we are seeing papilledema through ultrasound machine. So I think these are the simple measures which can prevent us by doing extraordinary measures, and this will say that patient is having increased intracranial pressure. So thank you, Puneet, and it was such a wonderful lecture. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We will see you next week, Monday before 6:30, with next residents either from AIIMS or Tata Memorial Hospital. Thank you, Arun. Thank you, Nisha. Thank you, Archana. And thank you, Puneet. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.